March 7, 1945. Before dawn, the roads of Western Germany are already alive. Engines growl in the cold air, tires grind against broken pavement, columns of American trucks move without pause, headlights hooded, drivers bent forward with exhaustion and focus. Men have been awake for nearly a day, some longer. They do not ask where this road finally ends, they only know it does not stop. Far ahead, beyond ruined villages and retreating German rear guards, the Rhine River waits, wide, cold, and assumed to be untouchable. For months, it has stood as the last great natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of the Third Reich. Every plan, every timetable, every cautious calculation has revolved around it. At Supreme Allied headquarters, reports begin to arrive. Incomplete, fragmented, almost unbelievable. George S. Patton's Third Army has not slowed after the winter fighting. It has not paused to regroup. Instead, it has surged forward with a speed that defies maps, fuel estimates, and accepted doctrine. When the full picture finally reaches Dwight D. Eisenhower, the question forming in his mind is not tactical. It is personal. Because if the reports are true, Patton has just done something no one thought possible, and done it in less than 24 hours. The circumstances that made such a moment conceivable were shaped long before this night unfolded. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, uncertain phase. Nazi Germany was collapsing, but not yet defeated. The Ardennes counteroffensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, had failed to break Allied lines, but it had achieved something else. It had reminded Allied commanders that desperation could still be dangerous. Tens of thousands of casualties, entire divisions exhausted, supply lines stretched thin by winter weather and shattered infrastructure. In January and February, Allied forces pushed east again. Slowly, methodically, town by town, bridge by bridge, Eisenhower's strategy remained unchanged, a broad front advance designed to deny the Germans any chance of concentrating force. It was a plan built on caution, coordination, and overwhelming logistics. Speed was desirable, but never at the expense of control. At the center of every map stood the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been Germany's shield. Wide, fast-flowing, and bordered by steep banks in many places, it was more than a river. It was a psychological line. German engineers had prepared demolitions on every major bridge. Fortifications and artillery positions covered the crossings. The assumption, shared by both sides, was simple. The Rhine would be crossed only after careful planning, massive preparation, and coordinated assaults. Allied planners expected weeks of preparation once the river was reached, stockpiling bridging equipment, concentrating infantry and armor, air superiority already secured, but ground movement still constrained by destroyed roads and fuel shortages. In Eisenhower's headquarters, the focus was balance. British and American armies advancing together, no single commander moving too far ahead of the others, no exposed flanks, no risks that could undo months of progress in a single mistake. This mindset was not born of fear, it was born of experience. The Western Allies had learned, again and again, that speed without supply could be fatal. In 1944, the rapid breakout from Normandy had stalled not because of German resistance, but because trucks could not deliver fuel fast enough. Patton himself had felt that limitation sharply. His Third Army had been forced to halt in Lorraine, engines silent, tanks useless without gasoline. Now in early March 1945, those same logistical realities still applied. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed, rail lines twisted into scrap. Fuel was rationed down to the gallon. Even victory had a speed limit. Or so it seemed. Because while Eisenhower planned for a deliberate approach to the Rhine, something unexpected was happening on the ground. German defenses west of the river were thinner than intelligence had predicted. Units were under strength. Morale was brittle. Command structures were breaking down under constant Allied pressure. And within that growing gap between expectation and reality, one commander saw opportunity where others saw risk. That commander was George S. Patton. But to understand why his actions would soon shock even his own supreme commander, It is necessary to understand the man himself and the army he drove forward. George Smith Patton Jr. had never been a comfortable fit within Allied high command. Brilliant, aggressive, and relentlessly driven, he believed war was won not by balance, but by pressure, constant, overwhelming, and unrelenting. To Patton, hesitation was not caution. It was surrendering initiative. His philosophy was simple and unforgiving. Strike faster than the enemy could think, move farther than they believed possible, and never allow them time to recover. By March 1945, Patton's Third Army had been fighting almost continuously for 9 months. From the breakout in Normandy, across France, through the bitter fighting in Lorraine, and into the freezing chaos of the Ardennes, his troops had developed a reputation that matched their commander. They moved fast, they improvised, they endured. But they were also exhausted. Divisions were under strength, vehicles were worn down by constant use. Maintenance crews worked through the night to keep engines alive. Fuel remained the most precious commodity on the battlefield. Every advance required careful calculation. How far could the army move before the tanks ran dry? Patton understood this reality better than anyone. He also understood something else: momentum. After the German failure in the Ardennes, Patton sensed that the enemy's cohesion was collapsing faster than Allied intelligence fully recognized. German units were retreating in disorder. Communications were fragmented. Commanders were improvising withdrawals rather than executing coordinated defense. Where Eisenhower saw the Rhine as a deliberate objective, Patton saw it as a race. The Third Army was positioned south of the Ruhr, driving through the Saar and into the Rhineland. Unlike the British and American forces further north, Patton faced fewer large urban obstacles. The terrain favored rapid movement, rolling countryside, smaller towns, road networks that, while damaged, were still passable. Most importantly, Patton had prepared his army for exactly this moment. Since the summer of 1944, he had drilled his staff to think in hours, not days. Orders were short, decisions decentralized. Division commanders were encouraged to act first and report later. It was not recklessness. It was controlled aggression built on trust and shared understanding. Yet even within this culture of speed, limits remained. Crossing the Rhine was not a decision Patton was authorized to make on his own. Any major river assault required approval from Supreme Headquarters. Bridging equipment was scarce and allocated carefully. Surprise was valuable, but failure would be catastrophic. And still, Patton pressed forward. As his armored columns pushed east, reports began filtering back to Third Army headquarters that would have stopped most advances cold. German bridge demolitions were incomplete. Rear guards were thin. In some places, resistance dissolved almost as soon as it was encountered. Then came news from further north, unexpected, electrifying, and dangerous. A bridge over the Rhine still stood. Its name was Remagen, and the existence of that single span would turn Patton's relentless drive into a moment of strategic shock, one that would reverberate all the way to Eisenhower's desk. The stage was set for perspectives to collide. The human angle. For the soldiers of the Third Army, speed was no longer a concept, it was a physical condition. Men slept sitting upright in trucks, boots stayed on for days, hands remained stiff from gripping steering wheels and rifle stocks in freezing wind. Meals were cold, eaten quickly, often without stopping the column. Orders came fast, sometimes scrawled on maps, sometimes passed verbally at roadside halts measured in minutes. There was fear, but it was a distant fear. Exhaustion drowned it out. What remained was momentum, a sense that stopping might be worse than moving forward. Veterans knew that hesitation invited artillery, counterattacks, and ambushes. Forward motion felt safer than rest. They were not told about Remagen, they were told to advance. The leadership angle. Patton's command style was not built on consultation, it was built on intent. He made his expectations unmistakably clear, then trusted his subordinates to find the way. Division and corps commanders were given objectives, not instructions. If a bridge was out, find another. If resistance stiffened, bypass it. If fuel was low, redistribute and move anyway. This philosophy clashed sharply with Eisenhower's approach. Eisenhower valued unity above all else. He believed wars were won by coalitions, not individuals. No commander, no matter how talented, was permitted to outrun the larger plan. Patton accepted this in theory. In practice, he constantly tested its limits. The enemy angled. On the German side, the collapse was uneven and confusing. Some units fought with discipline and desperation. Others melted away. Orders from higher command were contradictory. The expectation had been that the Rhine would be reached with time to prepare demolitions and establish defensive lines. Instead, Allied armor appeared faster than German engineers could react. Communication failures compounded the problem. Telephone lines were cut. Radio networks overloaded. Local commanders often acted on outdated assumptions, believing the Rhine still lay days away. This blind spot between expectation and reality created a fleeting window. And fleeting windows decide wars. As Patton's army surged forward, these human, leadership, and enemy dynamics converged, creating conditions that made speed not just possible, but decisive. Yet pressure alone does not win breakthroughs. It must be matched by timing, technology, and moral risk. Those elements would soon define the second set of angles shaping this moment. The tactical angle. Speed had become Patton's primary weapon. German defensive doctrine relied on delay, small rear guards, buying time for larger formations to regroup behind prepared lines. Patton shattered this logic by denying those hours entirely. Columns bypassed resistance rather than engaging it. Infantry rode tanks. Artillery displaced forward before previous fire missions were complete. Every mile gained reduced the enemy's ability to react. But speed created exposure. Flanks stretched thin. Supply columns lagged dangerously behind combat units. A single organized German counterattack could sever the spearhead from its support. Patton accepted that risk. The logistical angle. Nothing moved without fuel. By March 1945, Allied logistics were functioning but strained. Fuel dumps were forward, but distribution depended on truck convoys navigating damaged roads and destroyed bridges. Engineers worked continuously, throwing temporary spans across rivers only hours after German demolitions. Patton's staff tracked fuel consumption almost obsessively. Tank units were rotated forward and back to conserve gasoline. Idle engines were forbidden. Every unnecessary mile was eliminated. The margin was razor-thin. One miscalculation would immobilize the advance in enemy territory. The moral and strategic angle. Patton's critics within Allied command were not blind to his successes, but they feared his methods. If his advance collapsed, it would not only cost lives, it would fracture Allied unity. Eisenhower's greatest fear was not defeat, it was a failure that would force the Allies to rescue one of their own commanders from his own ambition. Yet there was another moral dimension. Every hour the war continued meant more civilian suffering, more camps undiscovered, more cities bombarded. Patton believed speed was mercy. End the war faster and fewer would die. This belief did not make his decisions easier, but it made them inevitable. As Third Army units drove deeper into Germany, the question was no longer whether Patton was moving too fast. It was whether anyone could stop him before he reached the river itself. The answer would come suddenly, at a bridge no one expected to still exist. March 7, 1945, late morning. The town of Remagen lay battered but standing along the west bank of the Rhine. Smoke drifted from damaged buildings. German troops moved through the streets in disorder, some retreating, others searching for orders that never arrived. And spanning the river stood the Ludendorff Bridge. It was an old structure built during the First World War. heavy steel trusses, stone towers at each end, designed to carry rail traffic, not tanks under fire. By every expectation, it should already have been destroyed. But it was. German engineers had prepared demolition charges, but shortages, faulty wiring, and confusion had delayed the final order. Some explosives were missing, others had been hastily installed. The plan was to destroy the bridge when the Americans reached the far bank. They reached it sooner than expected. Elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, advancing under 1st Army, not Patton's 3rd, were the first to spot the bridge intact. Without waiting for detailed orders, forward commanders made a decision measured in seconds. Infantry rushed forward. Engineers followed. German defenders fired desperately from the towers. At 3:00 p.m., American troops crossed the Rhine on foot. Within hours, tanks followed. Word of the crossing spread rapidly through Allied command. It was electrifying and destabilizing. The Rhine had been breached not by weeks of preparation, but by opportunism. And further south, George Patton was already moving. Though Remagen was not in his sector, its existence changed everything. The psychological barrier of the Rhine had been shattered. What had been theoretical became immediate. Patton did not need to cross at Remagen to act on its implications. He accelerated. Orders went out across 3rd Army. No pauses, no consolidation, move east, find crossings, exploit confusion. Fuel was redirected forward. Engineers were pushed to their limits. At Eisenhower's headquarters, reports arrived faster than they could be digested. One crossing was understandable, 2 might be luck. But what Patton was attempting defied doctrine. Because while Remagen held, Patton was positioning his army to force the Rhine elsewhere, within hours. The moment of realization was approaching. The reports reaching Supreme Allied headquarters on March 7 and March 8 did not arrive as a single clear narrative. They came in fragments, unit logs, fuel requests, engineer updates, radio intercepts. Individually, none seemed extraordinary. Together, they formed a picture that was deeply unsettling. Patton's 3rd Army was not slowing. South of Remagen, his columns were already probing the Rhine's approaches. Engineers identified ferry points. Reconnaissance units tested riverbanks under fire. Bridging equipment, never intended to be used this early, was being rushed forward, sometimes diverted from other armies without prior coordination. This was not the plan. Eisenhower had expected the Rhine crossing to be a controlled, synchronized operation. Montgomery in the north, Bradley and Patton in supporting roles, timetables aligned, risks managed. Instead, Patton was acting as though the timetable no longer mattered. On March 8, 3rd Army elements reached the river near Oppenheim. German resistance was disorganized but deadly in bursts. Machine gun nests fired from the far bank. Artillery shells splashed into the water, but the defense lacked depth. There were no prepared kill zones, no layered response. Patton ordered an immediate crossing. Assault boats slipped into the Rhine under cover of darkness. Infantry paddled across in silence, weapons held above the water. Some boats were hit, others made it through. By midnight, a foothold existed on the eastern bank. Within 24 hours of the Remagen crossing, Patton had forced the Rhine in his own sector. When Eisenhower received confirmation, the meaning was unmistakable. The Rhine, the Great Barrier, had not just been crossed, it had been overrun. Eisenhower's reaction, recorded later by staff officers, was a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. The speed was unprecedented, the risk enormous. Had it failed, the consequences would have been catastrophic. But it had not failed. Patton had done what he always did, moved faster than permission, faster than expectation, faster than doctrine. The war's tempo shifted in that moment. German defensive planning unraveled. Allied command priorities changed overnight. What had been a cautious advance became a pursuit. Yet victory, even accelerated, carries consequences. And the full cost and meaning of Patton's decision would only become clear in the days that followed. By March 9, 1945, the Rhine's western bank had ceased to be a defensive line. Patton's audacious maneuver had forced the Germans into reactive chaos. Units meant to hold the river in strength were scattered. Orders from high command arrived late, if at all, leaving soldiers isolated and unsupported. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, still intact, became a focal point. Engineers worked tirelessly to expand the crossing for tanks, artillery, and trucks. The Americans established a bridgehead that would serve as a springboard for additional operations across the Rhine. Third Army columns continued their relentless push east. Villages that had been expected to see days of resistance fell in hours. Roads once considered impassable became conduits for armor and mechanized infantry. Patton's gamble on speed, risking overextended supply lines and potential encirclement, paid off. Fuel convoys moved forward under escort. Maintenance crews repaired vehicles on the move. The army, operating on an unprecedented tempo, became almost unstoppable. Reports from the front filtered back to Supreme Headquarters. Officers described exhausted but exhilarated troops. Engineers who had feared disaster marveled at their own success. German resistance, when it did appear, was piecemeal. One after another, towns were liberated, artillery positions abandoned, and roadblocks overrun. The psychological effect on German command was profound. Radio intercepts later revealed confusion and disbelief. Commanders had expected weeks to prepare for a crossing of the Rhine. Instead, American forces had forced it in a day, changing the calculus of defense entirely. The speed of Third Army's advance forced Eisenhower to reassess. Orders were delayed, priorities shifted, and caution had to give way to exploitation. Patton had not merely crossed the river, he had rewritten the operational map. Yet even amid the exhilaration, commanders remained aware of the fragility of the situation. One misstep, one counterattack, could still undo the gains of a day. The immediate success had created opportunity, but it had also introduced new dangers that had to be managed without slowing the momentum that had become Third Army's greatest weapon. In the days following Patton's unprecedented advance, the consequences rippled across both sides of the conflict. German forces, already depleted and demoralized, were forced into a retreat that became a rout in some sectors. Armored units that could have reinforced defensive lines were cut off or destroyed. The Rhine, once considered an almost insurmountable barrier, was no longer a strategic shield. For the Allies, the crossing accelerated the collapse of German defenses in Western Germany. Towns and cities previously expected to require coordinated sieges fell quickly. Supply lines strained under the rapid advance, but the risk paid off. Third Army maintained the momentum, exploiting confusion and disorganization among German units. Bridges were seized intact, rail lines secured, and artillery positions neutralized before defenders could regroup. Every hour gained shortened the war's remaining timeline. Eisenhower's relationship with Patton, always complex, shifted subtly after the Remagen crossing. Reports from headquarters revealed both admiration and exasperation. Patton had disregarded standard procedures and risked overextension, but he had succeeded spectacularly. High command now faced the challenge of balancing caution with exploitation, knowing that Patton's audacity had changed the tempo of operations irreversibly. Casualty figures during this rapid advance were surprisingly moderate. Thanks to speed and surprise, engineers, infantry, and armor worked in tight coordination, minimizing prolonged exposure to enemy fire. Estimates indicate that Third Army inflicted disproportionate disruption relative to its size and risk taken. The moral impact on both troops and commanders was immediate. The perception of German invincibility along the Rhine evaporated, replaced by the realization that bold, rapid action could dictate outcomes. Strategically, the Rhine crossing marked a turning point in the final Allied push into Germany. Supply and logistical networks were stretched, but the resulting chaos among German forces prevented organized counterattacks. The crossing shortened operational timelines for subsequent campaigns, allowing the Allies to advance on multiple fronts simultaneously. By March 20, 1945, Third Army was already deep into central Germany, a testament to the effectiveness of calculated audacity. Patton's actions during these 24 hours would be studied for decades. Military academies analyzed the balance of speed, risk, and improvisation. Eisenhower himself would acknowledge, in private reports, the duality of the achievement, reckless to some, genius to others. The crossing became a case study in exploiting opportunity, pushing limits, and trusting both commander and soldier in a fluid battlefield. The Rhine had fallen, not through weeks of preparation, but through hours of decisive action, an action that would echo in the final chapters of the European War. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 was more than a military maneuver. It was a study in human audacity, timing, and the delicate interplay between caution and courage. In the span of 24 hours, George Patton had reshaped the battlefield, forcing his superiors and enemies alike to confront the limits of expectation. Speed had become a weapon as lethal as artillery. Opportunity had become as decisive as planning. Eisenhower's disbelief, tempered by respect, highlights a timeless tension in warfare, the conflict between structured strategy and individual initiative. Patton's success was not luck. It was preparation meeting risk, audacity meeting discipline, and judgment meeting chaos. Each soldier, each truck, each engineer's plank across the Rhine contributed to a moment where history accelerated, where the rules of engagement bent under human will. The event also revealed the fragility of even the most formidable defenses. The Rhine, long thought insurmountable, fell to ingenuity, momentum, and the courage to act before permission was granted. It stands as a reminder that in war, as in life, barriers exist only until someone chooses to challenge them decisively. Beyond the battlefield, the crossing carried moral resonance. By forcing a rapid collapse of German defenses, the operation shortened the war in Europe, likely saving lives that would have been lost in prolonged sieges or attritional campaigns. Yet it also underscored the thin line between risk and recklessness, a line Patton walked with uncanny precision. In the end, the story of Remagen and Patton's 24-hour drive is one of paradox, discipline in chaos, audacity in restraint, and human resolve overriding both expectation and fear. It is a testament to the power of decisive action, the weight of leadership, and the enduring truth that sometimes the impossible is simply the untried. The Rhine no longer divided. History moved forward faster than anyone could have imagined.